This is Land of Havilah, 2 Chronicles 23. Let's recap the kings of the previous 81 years in Judah. The house of David has been ruling, with the righteous King Asa on the throne for 41 years, then righteous Jehoshaphat for 25, then evil Jehoram for 8, then evil Amaziah for 1. They were the 5th through the 8th kings of the house of David. Then there were the 2 slaughters of the house of David. The first one by the king of Israel at Yahweh's command. He slaughtered that part of David's house that was related to the kings of the northern kingdom. The second slaughter was by Athaliah in Judah of the rest of the house of David. Now Athaliah has been ruling Judah for the last 6 years. Her parents were Ahab and probably Jezebel of Samaria. So what happened to Yahweh's promise to David that David would have a descendant on the throne in perpetuity? As of now, it looks to all the public that the word of Yahweh has failed. However, the priesthood's been hiding the sole survivor of the house of David. They've been secretly raising David's only living heir in the temple from the age of 1. He's now 7. His name is Joash. As we go through this chapter, we'll add information from the parallel account in 2 Kings 11. Now speaking of the high priest Jehoiada, who's been supervising the boy's secret upbringing, verse 1. In the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself. Comment, that means he got his nerve up. He's about to recruit some men for a righteous conspiracy to enthrone the boy king. Still in verse 1, Jehoiada took captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Jeroam, Ishmael the son of Jehohanan, Azariah the son of Obed, Maaseiah the son of Adaiah, and Elishaphat the son of Zichri into a covenant with him. Comment, those men aren't familiar to us and won't be mentioned again. Verse 2. They went around in Judah and gathered the Levites out of all the cities of Judah and the heads of fathers' households of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. Comment, Jehoiada's small group of co-conspirators that were named in verse 1 went around Judah and called the leading men to come to Jerusalem. Now they've come, but almost none of them know why they're there. Coming up, some of them will gather inside the temple where usually no one but the priests were allowed, and Jehoiada will break the news. Verse 3. All the assembly made a covenant with the king in God's house. He said to them, Behold, the king's son must reign, as Yahweh has spoken concerning the sons of David. Comment in verse 3, it seems the meeting took place inside the temple proper. Jehoiada, quote, showed them the king's son, 2 Kings 11:4. The leading men agreed to support him, quote, all the assembly made a covenant with the king, end quote. He's already being called king because the throne is already rightfully his, even though he's not on it. Now Jehoiada will give the priests and Levites their instructions. Verse 4. This is the thing that you must do. The third part of you who come in on the Sabbath of the priests and of the Levites shall be gatekeepers of the thresholds. A third part shall be at the king's house, and a third part at the gate of the foundation. All the people will be in the courts of Yahweh's house. But let no one come into Yahweh's house except the priests and those who minister of the Levites. They shall come in, for they are holy, but all the people shall follow Yahweh's instructions. The Levites shall surround the king, every man with his weapons in his hand. Whoever comes into the house, let him be slain. Be with the king when he comes in and when he goes out. Comment in verse 4, the priests and Levites coming on duty that day will function as guards. They'll place themselves in 3 locations, 1/3 of them at the thresholds, probably meaning the thresholds leading to the interior of the temple, 1/3 at the palace, and 1/3 at the gate of the foundation, which is probably a temple courtyard gate. In verse 5, the rest of the gathering, which is most of the people, will assemble in the courts. In verse 7, the Levites with weapons in hand will surround the king and stick with him whether he's inside or outside. They should kill anyone who tries to break through, quote, let him be slain. Verse 8. So the Levites and all Judah did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and they each took his men, those who were to come in on the Sabbath and those who were to go out on the Sabbath, for Jehoiada the priest didn't dismiss the shift. Comment, the shift of priests and Levites who were scheduled to go off duty that day stayed. In fact, in verse 2, all the priests and Levites were on hand. Verse 9. Jehoiada the priest delivered to the captains of hundreds the spears and bucklers and shields that had been King David's, which were in God's house. He set all the people, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, near the altar and the house around the king. Comment, the front of the temple is one solid mass of armed guards. Now to the porch of the temple, which is like an elevated stage, verse 11. Then they brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony and made him king. Jehoiada and his sons anointed him, and they said, Long live the king. Comment, they did three things. One, they put a crown on him. It's not mentioned much, but Saul had a crown, 2 Samuel 1:10, and probably every king thereafter. Two, they gave him the testimony, which is obscure. It might be a copy of the covenant they made to give him as he was taking office as king, or a copy of Scripture, an insignia, or some sort of physical object to hold in his hand that designated him as king. And three, they anointed him. This was with the holy anointing oil described by Yahweh in Exodus 30:25. Everything it touched became holy, Exodus 29:21. It was for the inauguration of priests, Exodus 29:21, and of kings, 1 Samuel 15:1. It was poured over the head liberally. In the case of Aaron, it ran down his beard to the edge of his robes, Psalm 133:2. The people are shouting, Long live the king, and verse 12. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came to the people into Yahweh's house. Then she looked, and behold, the king stood by his pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpets by the king. All the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets. The singers also played musical instruments and led the singing of praise. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and said, Treason, treason. Comment, in verse 13, the king stood by his pillar, which was customary at coronations, 2 Kings 11:14. There was a pillar on either side of the porch, 1 Kings 7:21. One pillar was called Yakin, which means he will establish. So if that was the pillar Joash stood by, it was a testimony that God would establish him on the throne. Speaking of establishing him, in verse 13, his rivals still alive, crying, Treason, treason. Verse 14. Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were set over the army, and said to them, Bring her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her, let him be slain with the sword. For the priest said, Don't kill her in Yahweh's house. So they made way for her. She went to the entrance of the horse gate to the king's house, and they killed her there. Comment, in verse 14, they brought her out between the ranks, meaning military men surrounded her and removed her from the courtyard. They took her to the horse gate of the king's palace and killed her. Coming up, the public will make a covenant, verse 16. Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, all the people, and the king that they should be Yahweh's people. Comment, coming up, we'll find for the first time that Jerusalem has a temple of Baal now. Probably it was built sometime in the last 15 years when either Athaliah's husband was on the throne or her son or herself. Her father built a temple to Baal in the royal city of the northern kingdom, 1 Kings 16:32, so it figures she would do the same. But now that the people have covenanted to be Yahweh's people, they're rejoicing over the new king, and they see Athaliah being carried away, verse 17. All the people went to the house of Baal, broke it down, broke his altars and his images in pieces, and killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Comment, coming up, it seems Athaliah prohibited sacrifices at Yahweh's house, but now, verse 18, Jehoiada appointed the officers of Yahweh's house under the hand of the priests, the Levites, whom David had distributed in Yahweh's house, to offer the burnt offerings of Yahweh, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, as David had ordered. He set the gatekeepers at the gates of Yahweh's house, that no one who was unclean in anything should enter in. He took the captains of hundreds, the nobles, the governors of the people, and all the people of the land, and brought the king down from Yahweh's house. They came through the upper gate to the king's house, and set the king on the throne of the kingdom. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. They had slain Athaliah with the sword. Comment, in verse 19, we see something oddly familiar, that Jehoiada set gatekeepers, quote, that no one who was unclean in anything should enter in, end quote. In Revelation 21:27, speaking of the New Jerusalem, quote, "There will in no way enter into it anything profane or one who causes an abomination or a lie, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life," end quote. Since those two scriptures are so similar, let's back up a minute and recognize this story as being twofold. At one level, it's the history of an event that took place in Judah around 841 B.C., namely during the 6-year reign of Athaliah. It looked like God's promise to David had failed, that David would have a descendant on the throne forever, but God came through with a hidden descendant. We might imagine the boy walked the streets of Jerusalem at times incognito, but eventually God established him on the throne. He was godly, raised in the house of God, taught by the priests. He was king in secret, then king in public, to great rejoicing, at which point Athaliah was slain. On the second level, this story was a subtle but clear foreshadowing of Christ, because 255 years after this, in 586 B.C., it looked like God's promise to David failed again. This was the year the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and removed the last king of the house of David. But that king wasn't the last one, because God had a descendant of David sequestered away in his house in heaven. He's not only king today, he has been all along, though he's not widely recognized. He came as Jesus and walked the streets of Jerusalem almost incognito. He didn't take the throne and was crucified, so to this day it looks like there's no king of David on the throne. But Christ will come and reign as king, Revelation 19:16, to our great rejoicing, Revelation 19:6. The devil will be thrown into the lake of fire forever, Revelation 20:10, and nothing profane will enter into the New Jerusalem. Everyone there will have covenanted with the king. God does not fail. 2 Chronicles 24 is next.